as she said, my name is Martha McIntire. I moved to Seymour when I was 4 years old, and so I've consequently lived here all my life. I have 5 children, all adults. I have grandchildren, great-grandchildren. I'm old, let's face it. And you know, as you get older, you become more interested in history and what went on a long time ago. And you know, when I was in high school and I took a history class, I'll have to tell you, I was bored to tears. I didn't, oh, thank you. You're welcome. I have a hip problem after I stand so long. Anyway, if I can get up here, yeah. I thought history was very boring. We memorized a lot of dates and talked about a lot of wars and a lot of important people, but we never got into the interesting part of history. And let me tell you, there's a lot of interesting parts to things that went on a long time ago. And you know, what's the first thing you think of when you think of the Roaring Twenties? Well, of course, you think about the flappers. You think about the short dresses. Lots of frills and ruffles. They were the most exciting part of that age, but they were that particular type of activity with the flappers and what was going on with the Great Gatsby, and in the more metropolitan areas was totally different from what was going on in the rural areas. When we think of the Roaring Twenties, you get the idea, and I'm sure that our kids think to themselves, oh, well, you know, everything was fun and games and light at that time. And that's not altogether the way it was, although the young people of that day were really, really into the flapper stage and the fun stage and the drinking and all the other things that went with it. When we talk about the flappers, immediately what comes to mind, well, if you think about it, in 1919 was when the law was passed regarding prohibition. And so that's what affected a lot of people during that period of time, because you had your bootleggers, your moonshiners, your speakeasies, and all those were very common in the larger cities and the larger areas. But let's think just a minute about what happened before 1920. The biggest thing that affected all the people of the United States and of the world was World War I, which, as you may remember, started in April of 1917. The United States finally entered the war with the sinking of the Lusitania. Do you realize that World War I only lasted from April of 1917 to November of 1918? It was really a very short war. Our involvement was very short. There were other nations warring before we got involved, but our involvement was actually a very short time. But it affected the people of this area a great deal. There were 19 young men from Jackson County that died in World War I. World War I was one of the worst wars for people to die in a short time. Many of them died from poison gas. And so many of these young people who were having all this fun and doing all these things were somewhat rebelling against what had happened in the last 10 years. They had seen their uncles, fathers, brothers killed in the war, and now that war was over and they were celebrating. So that affected a lot of them too. In the 1910s, the more popular styles were sort of the Gibson girl styles. They had long hair, they had long dresses, lots of flounces and ruffles. The girls wore bloomers. All of a sudden, here we are in the 1920s, and one of the first things they started doing was cutting their hair. And this was absolutely disgraceful to some of the older people. They just thought that was absolutely terrible. These women were cutting their hair. but it happened everywhere, and it infiltrated on down into the regular people all over the United States. Now, how do people get their information back then? When you began the year 1920, you had newspapers. You had word of mouth. You did not have radio, TV, or many telephones, or much ways of getting information from one place to another. So in the 1920s was when radio first began. In fact, I think it was 1921 or 22, a radio station in Philadelphia broadcast the first real broadcast of music and entertainment and things on the radio. From that time on, it kind of mushroomed. And by the end of the 1920s, 16 million people had radios, because it just mushroomed, and everybody loved it, and they wanted to have it, and they would go without something else in order to have a radio and hear the music and the news and the entertainment. It was, by the end of 1925, I think there were 500 broadcasting radios. Well, when you got radios starting to give out information, you also have commercials. So that's when the first commercials began, and that's what encouraged people to buy things that they never thought about before. So I want you to think about some of the things that were invented during the 1920s. And some of them were really, really exciting. Now, if you think about it, you know, the people that were the ordinary working people, at that time in 1920, only 28% of the people lived in rural America. Prior to that, America was basically a rural area. Lots of people were farmers, lots of people lived in the country. And of course that changed over time. And during the 20s, people started moving more into cities where they could get jobs, where they would have work that would pay them. Now, the average salary in 1920 was $1,500 a year. And that was for a 52-hour work week. There were no days off as such. Children as young as 12 and 13 were put to work in mines and in factories. And in 1916, they finally did pass a law that any child under 16 could only work a 40-hour week, and they could only work 8 hours a day. Prior to that, some of them were working 12 to 14 hours in mines just to keep their families going and have enough to eat. When I think about the 1920s, I think about how my grandmother lived. My grandmother had 6 children. Her husband died in 1914 and left her with 6 children. Well, keep in mind, there was no Social Security, there was no health insurance, there was nothing to help people. And so she went to work as a school teacher. And in order to do that, my mother had to quit school. She was in the 6th grade, and she had to quit school and take care of the younger children. And 2 of her brothers, who were closest to her in age, were farmed out. In other words, they were sent to live with farmers, and they would work all day on the farm for their room and board, and they never came home to live again. And these boys were children. They were actually children, and they were forced to work like that because they had no money. And eventually my grandmother did marry again, and she married a man with a little bit of money, so they were able to get by. But those 2 boys, my 2 uncles, were really, really scarred by that experience. It was very hard on them to leave their home and their mother and spend their days working. That's how life was back then. And you think about, you know, did they have any modern conveniences? In the cities, yes, they had electricity, they had running water, they had bathrooms, they had Some of them had central heating, and during the 1920s there were some very nice buildings going up in the urban areas. There were nice places to go. You know, the Farmers Club is a good illustration of that. Farmers would come in, and that's the present Chamber of Commerce building. It was called the Farmers Club, and it was built by the owners of the Blish Mill because the farmers would bring in their produce, their grain or whatever, to be milled or processed, and they would sell it, and then they would wait, and they would go into the Farmers Club. And you know why they liked to go there? It had a bathroom. It had electricity. It had a comfortable place they could sit and visit with their friends during the day, and they would come in and spend the day in town and go to the Farmers Club and meet their friends. It was a social type of activity, and that was a pretty big deal. When they went back home to coal oil lamps and no central heating and outdoor privies, and it wasn't such a nice way to live, but that's how it was back then. If you lived in town, you were able to have the electricity and you would have some of the benefits of it, but many, many rural families did not have that. And so, of course, if you don't have electricity, you don't have a refrigerator, you have problems with food and keeping your food preserved and trying to get enough ice so you can keep your things cold until you go back to the store again. So that was also something that they had to deal with. The average housewife back then spent 44 hours a week just preparing food for her family. There was not fast food. Oftentimes they only went to the store once a week, so some of the things they could pick up at the grocery store, if they used it up right away, it was gone, and they had to wait till the next time they made a trip to town. Now, many of them had their own gardens, they did their own food preservation. Canning was a big thing. In fact, during that period of time was when the Ball brothers in Muncie started up their big plant making canning jars. And if you've ever seen the Ball jars, a lot of them are collector's items back then, but still now, many people can their produce. They have little gardens and can what they have, and it's a good way to save money. Back then, it was a necessity. My mother, being diabetic, when I was young, canned everything. She canned all the fruit because you could not go to the store and pick up a can of fruit that didn't have sugar in it, because it was easier for them to can the food using a syrup or sugar with it because that preserved it better. So there were no fruits or anything like that that was canned without sugar. So she canned everything on her own. And people did that as a necessity. Of course, if you had a cellar, you could keep your potatoes and your carrots and things like that that you grew as long as you could. Of course, by the spring, they were pretty much all dried out, and they didn't taste as good, but it was better than nothing. And so they made do, and they used all their food, and they kept it and preserved it. You know, you think about what recreation they had back then. Actually, in the 1920s, basketball was a big deal. It had just come in, and all the kids played basketball in their yards if they could. There weren't as many organized sports, although there were some organized sports in schools. And in fact, I think in 1927, the high school in Portland won the Seymour sectional for the only time in their history. They beat Seymour in the final game. So they did play basketball in schools. Even the women had basketball teams in school, which is something they didn't have when I went to school. But they had sports for the kids. But the kids did a lot of things that were just, when they were home, they had to use their imaginations. And you can imagine if you have children of that age, or if you have grandchildren of that age, and you're trying to entertain them for the evening, it's so easy to put them in front of that TV set and say, okay, you know, you can watch this program. And maybe it's educational, or maybe it isn't, but it gives them something to do. Back then, they thought of their own things to do. One of the more popular